can start in the beginning. The beginnings, like how did you start in this video game industry? We know your first game was Isle, and it was like a one-move text adventure game. And we think that in that game, we can see the seed of what has been your work later. So can you just talk about how this game became a reality?
It's if you look back at Isle and then jump ahead, it does seem like there was a clear path. That it didn't seem that way at the time. I'll try and give you the short version. So yeah, I mean, Isle was something I did when I was at university, and it was kind of the first time I really got on the internet. So this was like late 90s. So, you know, it was the very simple internet at the time. And if you wanted to download games or share things, like the download speeds were such that like the more proper video games took too long to download. But there was this wonderful resurgence in text games, which were very convenient to share and distribute over that early internet. And it was a fascinating community because it was born of a nostalgia for the kind of classic text games that people like Infocom, Magnetic Scrolls made. And there were a couple of people, Graham Nelson in Oxford, I think. He created a tool that allowed you to build text games using the same system that these classic Infocom games were made with. So it kind of attracted people that loved those games, that had a nostalgia for them. But at the same time, it was a group of people who were all reasonably young. We were all accessing this through, you know, university computers. So we were all something of an academic mindset. And this community started to put together text games that, whilst they came from this nostalgic place, were very ambitious. So we all wanted to explore the possibilities of interactive narrative. It was very competitive. And the beautiful thing of text within video games is that you can author a one-person text game. You know, you can write, the fleet of battleships exploded, and then all the planets in the solar system were destroyed. And you can do that if you were to try and do that with CGI, it'd be too expensive. So it was this really interesting community. People like Adam Cardre, Andrew Plotkin, Emily Short, doing all these interesting experiments. And Isle came out of a frustration that I had with, because of this kind of nostalgic grounding, there was a thing that you did. So when you would play a new text game, the tradition was that to demonstrate how complex and sophisticated the parser was, you would type stupid things into the game and see if there was a response. So, you know, it might be that you're playing a game in which you're something like Plundered Hearts was a classic Infocom game where you're a young woman who's fallen in love with a pirate captain, and it's all swashbuckling. And so there would be a set of commands that would make sense and would, you know, be part of the progression of the narrative. But on starting that game, to test out the simulation, you would attempt to pick things up and throw them. You would see what happens if I try and take all my clothes off. What if I try and kill this person that's supposed to be my friend? And the tradition was you would get a funny answer. So the more polished game would give you a funny specific answer. Sometimes you want to kill your friend, but not today. Whatever, you know, it would give you like a little response. And so kind of coming from that tradition, it was still the case that as we were trying to create these things that were more ambitious narratively, people would still incorporate that kind of humor. And not only that, but when I played them, I would still kind of jump through those hoops. So, you know, there were games like Andrew Plotkin did a game called So Far, which was, remember at the time, people were sort of saying this is this very very deep fantasy work that's kind of half Bergman, half Gene Wolfe, and playing that, and it's somewhat serious, and I'm suspending my disbelief. I would still type the dumb things to just kind of test out the simulation, and just because it was almost instinct. And it kind of frustrated me that we did this, because if you go and sit and watch a serious movie, you're not kind of shouting things at the screen and saying silly jokes. So I made Isle, like the initial seed of Isle was, what if I made a game where when the player types the dumb thing, the game goes with it. And naturally, a lot of the things you type are somewhat violent or stupid. And it was like, well, what kind of character would the game be about if they were actually doing these things, if these made sense in the narrative? And I tried to pick a setting that was as mundane as possible, in which, again, to kind of very much distance it from this tradition. So I said, well, this is going to be a game that starts in the pasta aisle of a supermarket. And so that was the very simple seed was, oh, what if the game, the player types something violent and the game says, fine, I will give you a violent story, and essentially punishes the player. Like, I wanted to make people feel bad for typing these things and make them think, why did I tell the character to kill this woman? That's a terrible thing to type. And from that, then the game kind of emerged in this idea that because I was having to support this breadth of answers and that kind of complexity, I had to cut off the depth of the simulation. So that's where this idea of a one-move game came from. And I'd always, I had a love for kind of literary experiments and, some of the kind of fun gamesmanship you see in 20th century literature, where people are, chopping things up, or, J.G. Ballard's writing a short story that is written as the index of a fictional book, or a story told on playing cards where you can shuffle the playing cards, all these kind of ideas. So that kind of fitted for me, this idea that, oh, we're telling this story, and it will be told in these teeny little pieces. Every time I type something, I'll get a teeny little piece of story, which will kind of end the story. And they naturally were not consistent because they had to respond to whatever you were typing in the moment. But as I wrote it, there began to be kind of groupings of well, this series of stories are about this character. These are clearly about a different character. But I was fascinated by the kind of sculptural aspect of it, because as a player, your experience is, well, what were the first 5 stories I saw? That kind of anchors your perception of the story. And then there was kind of an effort sometimes on the part of players to find a good story. A lot of these stories had sad endings, but then there were a series, I think, I could be wrong, but I think a lot of the good endings relied on you pulling knowledge back. So the opening text does not mention anybody by name. I think the opening text, I think it mentions a holiday in Rome, and certain routes that you can take will talk about how you went to Rome with a character called Claire. So now you can roll that back into your knowledge and you start again fresh. And now you can type call for Claire or remember Claire. And I think if the player kind of worked at it and tried to incorporate some of that knowledge, it made it easier for them to kind of steer the narrative to a more meaningful one, which was kind of interesting, because that mirrored, like I say, this was developed in quite an exploratory way. And so it was kind of only during its development that kind of a shape emerged. So it's quite nice that kind of the way I wrote it mirrored to some extent how people will actually play it and try and seek out a shape to that narrative. So that was Isle. But at that time, that was something I was doing as a hobby. I kind of not come from a tradition of even being aware that a creative career was a thing. So I was my father, I think, was the first person to go to university in our family, and he came from a family of builders. And so I was told, go to university and get a good degree, and you can be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor or something if you try really hard. But I had always been interested in storytelling and art and things. So I was doing all this stuff. And it just never occurred to me that, oh, this is a thing you can go do. Like, you can have a career telling interactive stories. So although it feels like Isle was the stuff I wanted to do, and then later on, particularly with like Silent Hill Shattered Memories, and then something like Her Story, there's definitely a through line there. There was a lot of kind of zigzagging to get there.
Amazing. There's a lot of stuff there that we will go back to later, like information and having these kind of exchanges with the player. But now we want to talk about, after Isle, you moved on to more traditional and established franchises like Serious Sam or Ghost Rider, and in particular Legacy of Kain with the cancelled project Dead Sun. So how was it to move from this very experimental and very small thing to more traditional industrial projects with pre-existing worlds and pre-existing franchises and fictional coordinates? And in particular, again, Legacy of Kain, which was a very ambitious project and a very sad things to see go.
Well, yeah, I think those early games, like I said, when I was at university, it hadn't occurred to me that there was a career in this stuff. And especially like that text game community, every now and then someone would come along and be like, couldn't we rebirth the idea of commercial interactive fiction? And everyone would just be like, shh, crazy person. But after university, I got a job in America working for a kind of a prototype Elon Musk, a guy called Michael Saylor, who was doing weird things with databases. And I kind of took that job because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And it sounded exciting to go to America and work for an eccentric millionaire or billionaire. At some point, there were some issues with how they did their accounting, which saw my subsidiary shut down. So I then kind of moved to another company. And at some point, I moved back to the UK. It didn't make sense visa-wise for me to still be in America. And I was now kind of looking for a job, and all the .com companies were kind of going bust at that time, and everyone was convinced that I was a .com person. But I had a friend who had become a programmer working for a video games company, and he knew that I was an artist and that I did painting. So he said, oh, you could be a video game artist. So I downloaded, at the time, illegal copies of like Maya and 3D Studio and all the packages. I've since paid my dues, so we're good. And kind of put together this small portfolio. And that led to me getting a job as an artist on Serious Sam. And very quickly, they moved me to the design team because I wouldn't shut up about game design. And then at some point, I still wouldn't shut up, so they made me a lead designer. But at that point, like, I had kind of sidestepped into the industry. And like, I loved video games, so it kind of made sense. But it was only really, so I made a ton of games. Some of them came out. But it was a very good education in some of the craft of video game narrative, even though none of those games had particularly good narratives, because it meant like we did the Ghost Rider movie game, which was before people had high expectations of superhero movies or superhero games. But we were paired with a couple of Marvel writers, Jimmy Palmiotti and Garth Ennis, who were writing the script. And they did not allocate a lot of time to it because this was just like a very small job for them. And I was getting like the screenplay for the movie. And as the designer of that game, I went and I read every Ghost Rider comic. And I was like, I'm going to take this seriously. Like, I need to learn about Ghost Rider. And then I read the movie script and I was like, this isn't a very good movie script. And they were like, oh, it's fine. That's how movies work. They'll draft it. They didn't. And then we got the game script, and it was kind of somewhat frustrating because, Garth and Jimmy would go away and they would write pages of stuff and give it to us, and it didn't necessarily fit the game or, the types of action. in the cinematics didn't mirror what was happening in the game. And so I was pushing, and at one point I went home and I rewrote the whole script, and everyone agreed like this made a lot more sense, but there was a kind of political thing of, well, we have to use the script that comes from Marvel. And then I worked on, there was a cancelled RPG that was being developed in Bratislava, and we were brought in to kind of save this project. And that involved a kind of top-down rewrite of this game that had been written, and people might be aware that, like, in Germany, RPGs and very kind of traditional RPGs were very cool. Like the German audience loves those. And so this game, I think, had been funded by a German company. But they were looking at it and going, this needs to make sense for an international audience. So we were brought in and we said, well, what's the pitch of this game? And they said, oh, this is a game about the elves, like the Tolkien elves, before all the other races existed. So that's going to be really interesting. And we were like, oh, that's cool. So is this like the elves back before they were all sophisticated? And, you know, is this like a more primal, interesting take on elves? And they're like, no. The elves have always been that way because they're elves. So we're like, so you're basically taking the rich fantasy world and you're just taking out all the other interesting races. And so we retooled it. And it was kind of a horrific, I'm sure from their perspective, horrific job where I got a drop of all the art assets. And regardless of what they were intended to be, we just kind of looked at them like, oh, we have this character who's wearing this smart uniform. He looks like he would be a kind of bitchy prince. He's going to be a prince, and like put all these things together. And I made up a new story that was essentially a kind of World War II film noir about spies crashing behind enemy lines, and made it about elves. So it was a griffin that crashed. And it was magic rather than bombs and weapons. And so, you know, I got to, because the situation was so dire, no one questioned that I was writing the script for this thing. Because I think if it had been more formal, if it had been a bigger publisher, and I'd said, can I write this thing? There would have been questions about that. But I was like, look, I've written some stuff before, you know, look at Isle and other things. You know, I'd done these passes on other scripts for the games we've worked on. And I went away and wrote this, and we recorded the whole thing. And with like a voice cast that's now all the big names in video game voices, like Troy Baker and Laura Bailey and all these people, they were all my elves. So I was doing things like that was kind of just really getting to understand how you do the voiceover, how you do the motion capture. And, you know, I was pushing some ideas that I had about how narrative should be integrated, but these were not necessarily the best vehicles for it. And then at some point, we got a chance to work on Silent Hill. I'll try and do the short version of this, but essentially the company I was working for had another office that, through various pieces of luck, got the chance to make a Silent Hill game, which was the origin story to the very first Silent Hill game, which, to start with, is a terrible idea, because Silent Hill 1 tells its origin. Like the story of Silent Hill 1 is revealing what happened 7 years ago with flashbacks, with diary entries. Like it tells you everything that happened. So some business person who hadn't necessarily played all the games was like, everyone loves Silent Hill 1. Let's do a prequel to it. And it got greenlit. But the game that was being made from this premise, and we were a great remove sort of seeing what was happening with this game, was even with, you know, that premise was doing a bad job of it. So as someone that had played those games, there were big issues. You know, this game that took place 7 years prior had characters that were older than in the original game. Characters who were only introduced to the supernatural in the original game are now fully aware of it. So, you know, it was doing lots of weird things with narrative. The tone of it did not seem true. And through another series of random and lucky events, the team that was making that game had issues with their game engine. So my team, who at the time I think was working on Ghost Rider, we said, well, we have this game engine that can do character action and runs on a PSP, I think was required at the time. So we put together a demo in a week, I think, of, oh, this is how a Silent Hill game would look in our engine. Gave that to the team, saved them, and then 6 months down the line, the project was still having issues. They were attempting to do this kind of Resident Evil camera, and they had all these issues that I mentioned with the story. And at some point, there was me and particularly the lead artist I worked with, Neil, who were both fans of Silent Hill. We kept kind of saying, it's not fair that we're not getting to make this thing because they're making all these mistakes. At some point, the bosses turned around and said, apparently they are making lots of mistakes. How about you guys finish this game? And we were like, yeah, we'd love to do that. And then they said, well, half the money's already been spent and all the time has been used up. So you get 6 months to make this game and very little money. So that became a very intense, and again, there was no time for people to question me writing this thing. The producer at Konami was terrified because he had this problem on his hands. My bosses had this problem on their hands. So I was like, we need to rewrite this script in a week, because we had only 6 months to get it to the motion capture, to get it to all the different stages. We needed a script in a week. So I was like, I'm going to go home and write the script. And then they said, well, there's no time to storyboard it. We can't do that. So I would go home and I would storyboard it myself. So I'd work a full day, then go home and storyboard at home. And then we said, well, look, none of the enemies in this game make any sense. Like in Silent Hill, the enemies have some symbolic logic behind them and a certain aesthetic. And again, they said, well, we haven't got time to read concept all the enemies. So I would go home and I would come up with enemy concepts and draw them. And it was not, I, as a fan of Silent Hill and as an observer, I would totally acknowledge that Silent Hill Origins is a mediocre game. It is a straight 7 out of 10. And it has no right to exist as part of the Silent Hill storyline. Like it's a redundant piece of story. It introduces this character Travis just from nowhere, who suddenly now has a pivotal role in the history of Silent Hill. And there were two things that we didn't like that we were locked into. One was your protagonist is this trucker called Travis, which was born of this crazy notion that the game should be kind of Evil Dead. They had this kind of vision that it was going to be like an Evil Dead comedy horror thing. And they had this trucker who shows up. And the version before we took over, he had a catchphrase that was like, I just want to get back to my truck, which was his like response to everything. So we were stuck with him because we wanted to change him, but they said, sorry, we've already shown a trailer. Like we've done marketing stuff with this character. The other thing was they had, as an origin project, they wanted to dig into the origins of the character Pyramid Head, who at that point was very popular. And he, within the games, exists only in Silent Hill 2, and is particularly tied into that storyline and is a beautiful piece of kind of abstract horror imagery. But when they made the movie of Silent Hill, they put him in that because they were like, he just looks cool, so he's going to be in there. So what they were doing for Origins was they were going to tell explain this character, which of course is the thing you should never do. Ridley Scott in Prometheus, like never, if you have this wonderful nightmare, do not explain it. Do not tell me about Freddy Krueger when he was a baby, and the script that we looked at had Pyramid Head was a chef who was a cannibal chef who someday decided to start attaching metal plates to his head because he was crazy. And we were like, no. They're like, that's not, like, this thing is born of nightmares and things. And he's not a real person doing this to himself. So we got that thrown out, but they said, you have to have him in there. They were like, again, I think the marketing had been, the silhouette of this pyramid head type guy and this trucker. So that was when we pushed. We kept pushing. We kept saying, "Can we just not have him in the game?" And we kind of, at some point, there's a note in the game that acknowledges that he was like the fevered imagining of somebody that had seen a painting in the historical. We did our best to just sort of lampshade this thing. But so that game is not great. It is kind of fanficky, but as an achievement, I think it's probably the greatest achievement of any game I've worked on, because in 6 months we took this thing which the world has never seen, but if they had seen, would have been abhorrent to this incredible franchise, and we took it to a 7 out of 10. And that meant that we had a certain amount of kudos with Konami, because they'd seen that we had swung this back round and pulled off something which was fine. And that led to a series of discussions, which again took a long time, very tortuous, led to us getting to make Silent Hill Shattered Memories. Similar number of freak occurrences. At some point, we were pitching an original Silent Hill game on Wii. That went away. There was another business discussion where I think Konami were asking for us to make another PSP game. And the guy who ran our studio, Simon Gardner, as I remember it, on the call said, "We don't want to make another of those. It will get 7 out of 10. It doesn't help us as a studio." And the producer on the other end said, "Well, what if we let you make your cool Wii game as well? So you do the thing that we want, because we think PSP and Sony want us to do this, and we think it's a good idea. And you can make your cool, innovative Silent Hill game." And that happened. And then at some point further down the line, someone at Konami said, "Why are you making 2 games? Why are we making this PSP thing and a Wii thing? They should be the same." And during all this, the same producer at Konami noted that at some point in history, I think he had been involved in this, the powers that be in Japan had greenlit the idea of doing a remake of Silent Hill 1. And the way things worked at Konami, like, you needed things to be signed off, and that could take a while. So he said, this remake has already been signed off. If we call this a remake, then we can start work on it tomorrow, and we don't have to do all the paperwork. So let's do that. At which point, pointed out that, Silent Hill Origins had been something of a remake with that material. The movie had essentially been an attempt to kind of remake that material, make the dialogue slightly easier to the kind of Western ear. And there wasn't like a huge amount of interesting stuff to do now. We'd been kind of churning this material, and it didn't feel as well for me personally like screwing around with someone else's story and someone else's mythology, especially the way we had to in Origins, didn't feel great. Like, that didn't feel like you were telling something interesting or genuine. And so I pitched, and I think I hadn't watched there was the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, which I hadn't watched, but I knew that people loved it. And I knew that the premise was that it had characters with the same names and a general situation, but was essentially a total reimagining of that story. So I said, let's do Battlestar Galactica with Silent Hill 1. So you can still tell your bosses that it's a remake, but it will be its own thing. And we took a lot of the ideas that I'd kind of pushed for this Wii thing, which involved this kind of framing device of a psychiatrist, kind of foregrounding this unreliable narrator, this idea that the game would dynamically assemble its story based on the way you played it. All those things we kind of took from those previous pitches, and kind of ran with it. And that was really the game where, you know, I had come up with the idea from nothing, and it was doing a lot of what was interesting to me about interactive storytelling. It was bringing a lot of the tools from the interactive fiction world. So what Isle was 1999. I think that game came out in 2009. So this was like 10 years on-ish. And that was really the point where I was sort of stepping back and going, oh, wow, this is what I want to be doing. Like, I want to be playing around with how we can tell stories in this interactive way. This is building on Isle. This is building on stuff I've been wanting to do and thinking about forever. I just never realized that was the goal. But now that I'm here, it's kind of really obvious.